The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the faint metallic tang of blood. Eleanor sat on the porch of her small clapboard house, her gnarled hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. At 78, her eyes still held a spark, though they were clouded with memories she'd spent decades trying to bury. The grandchildren were inside, their laughter a distant hum, like bees in a far-off meadow. She loved them fiercely, but today her mind was elsewhere. Back to that day 50 years ago when her world shattered. It was 1975 and Eleanor was 28, a young wife with a heart full of hope and a belly swollen with her first child. Her husband, Thomas, was the kind of man who could make you laugh until your sides ached, his grin wide enough to chase away any storm. They lived in a modest farmhouse in rural Tennessee, surrounded by fields of corn and the endless chatter of cicadas. Life wasn't easy, money was tight, and the farm demanded more than it gave. But Thomas's love was a steady anchor. That morning the sky had been a bruised purple, promising rain. Thomas had kissed her forehead before heading to the barn to fix a tractor that had been coughing like an old man. "I'll be back for supper, Ellie," he'd said, his voice warm as molasses. She'd smiled, unaware that those would be his last words to her. By noon the sheriff was at her door, his hat in his hands, his face grim. "Mrs. Grayson, there's been an accident," he said. The tractor had overturned, pinning Thomas beneath it. He was gone before anyone could reach him. Eleanor's knees buckled, and the world blurred into a haze of grief. She remembered screaming, though she couldn't hear her own voice, only the sheriff's steady hand guiding her to a chair. The rest of the day was a fog. Neighbors came with casseroles and condolences, their voices a dull roar in her ears. She sat on the couch, clutching Thomas's flannel shirt, its scent of sweat and hay the only thing tethering her to reality. Her brother-in-law, Caleb, arrived late in the afternoon, his boots heavy on the porch. Caleb was Thomas's older brother, a man with sharp eyes and a sharper temper. He'd always been a shadow in their lives, resentful of Thomas's charm and the farm they'd inherited together. "Ellie," Caleb said, his voice rough as gravel, "I'm here to help." She nodded, too numb to question his presence. She didn't notice the way his eyes lingered on her, or the way his hands clenched when he spoke of Thomas. As night fell, the house emptied of visitors, leaving Eleanor alone with her grief and Caleb. He insisted on staying, saying he'd handle the arrangements for Thomas's funeral. "You shouldn't be alone," he said, and she was too broken to argue. She retreated to her bedroom, curling into the bed that still smelled of Thomas, her sobs muffled by the pillow. It was past midnight when the door creaked open. Eleanor stirred, thinking it was a dream, until she felt the weight of Caleb's presence in the room. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're mine now," he said, his words slurred with whiskey and something darker. Before she could scream, his hands were on her, rough and unyielding. She fought, her nails clawing at his face, but he was stronger, fueled by a rage she didn't understand. The pain was searing, a violation that tore through her body and soul. She bled, physically, emotionally, until the world went dark. When she woke, Caleb was gone and the house was silent. Her body ached, her dress torn, blood staining the sheets. Shame burned hotter than the pain, and she scrubbed herself raw in the bathtub, trying to erase his touch. She told no one. Who would believe her? Caleb was a respected man in their small town, and she was just a grieving widow, pregnant and vulnerable. She buried the truth deep, where it festered like a wound that never healed. The days that followed were a blur of funeral preparations and whispered gossip. Eleanor moved through them like a ghost, her heart a hollow shell. She gave birth to her daughter Lily 3 months later, a bittersweet moment that anchored her to life. But every time she looked at Lily's face, she saw Thomas, and the shadow of Caleb's betrayal. Now, 50 years later, Eleanor sipped her coffee, the mug cold in her hands. The grandchildren's laughter pulled her back to the present, but the past clung to her like damp clothes. She'd never told anyone about that night, not even Lily, who was now a mother herself, but the weight of it was growing heavier, pressing against her chest. She knew she couldn't carry it to her grave. Eleanor's life after Thomas's death was a study in survival. She raised Lily alone, working the farm with hired hands and her own stubborn will. The townsfolk admired her resilience, calling her that tough Grayson widow, but they didn't see the night she cried herself to sleep, Or the way she flinched when Caleb's name was mentioned. He'd moved to Kentucky after the incident, claiming a job opportunity, but Eleanor knew he was running from his own guilt. She let him go, grateful for the distance, but his absence didn't erase the scars. Lily grew into a bright, curious girl, with Thomas's smile and Eleanor's fire. She married young to a kind man named Robert, and they gave Eleanor 3 grandchildren, Emma, Jacob, and little Sophie. The kids were her joy, their chaos a balm for her wounded heart. But as the years passed, Eleanor felt the past creeping closer, like a storm on the horizon. It started with a letter. It arrived on a crisp October morning, addressed in Caleb's shaky handwriting. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it, her coffee forgotten on the kitchen table. The letter was brief, written on cheap motel stationery. Ellie, I'm dying. Cancer. I need to see you. There are things I need to say. I'm in Nashville. Please come. Caleb. She burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the flames devour his words. But they lingered in her mind, a poison she couldn't shake. Why now? What could he possibly want after 50 years of silence? She told herself she owed him nothing but a part of her. The part that still believed in justice wanted answers. The decision to go wasn't easy. Lily noticed her mother's distraction, the way her hands shook when she poured tea. Mama, what's wrong? She asked one evening, her brow furrowed with concern. Eleanor hesitated. She'd spent decades protecting Lily from the truth, but the weight of it was crushing her. There's something I need to do, she said finally. An old debt to settle. Lily pressed, but Eleanor deflected, promising to explain when she returned. She packed a small bag and drove to Nashville, her heart pounding with every mile. The motel was a rundown place on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering like a dying star. Caleb was in room 12, a frail shadow of the man he'd been. His skin was sallow, his eyes sunken, but they still held that sharp glint she remembered. Ellie, he rasped, gesturing to a chair. Thank you for coming. She sat, her spine rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Say what you need to say, Caleb. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and began. He spoke of guilt, of nightmares that had haunted him for decades. He confessed to what he'd done that night, his voice breaking as he described the rage that had consumed him. Rage at Thomas for having everything he wanted. The farm, Eleanor's love, a future. I was drunk out of my mind, he said. But that's no excuse. I've hated myself every day since. Eleanor listened, her face a mask of stone. She wanted to scream, to hurl the chair at him, but she sat still, letting his words wash over her. When he finished, he reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Why tell me now? She asked, her voice low and dangerous. Because I'm dying, he said. And I need your forgiveness. She laughed, a bitter sound that startled them both. Forgiveness? You think words can undo what you did? You took everything from me, Caleb. My safety, my trust, my peace. He hung his head, tears dripping onto the faded carpet. I know, but I had to try. Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady. You don't get to decide when I heal, she said. That's mine to carry, not yours. She left without another word, the door slamming behind her. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage. She stopped at a gas station, splashing cold water on her face, trying to steady her breathing. She'd gone to Nashville for answers, but all she'd found was more pain. Yet something shifted inside her. A crack in the wall she'd built around that night. She realized she couldn't keep carrying the secret alone. It was time to tell Lily. When she got home, Lily was waiting, her eyes wide with worry. Eleanor sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd burned Caleb's letter. The words came slowly, haltingly, as she recounted the night of Thomas's death and Caleb's betrayal. Lily listened, her face paling, her hands gripping Eleanor's. When Eleanor finished, Lily was crying, her anger a mirror of her mother's. Why didn't you tell me? Lily asked, her voice breaking. I wanted to protect you, Eleanor said. I thought I could carry it alone. Lily hugged her fiercely, and for the first time in 50 years, Eleanor felt the weight of her secret lighten just a fraction. But the storm wasn't over. Caleb's confession had stirred something else, a need to confront the past, not just for herself, but for the family she'd fought so hard to protect. The weeks after Nashville were a reckoning. Eleanor felt raw, like a wound exposed to air after years of being bandaged. Telling Lily had been both a relief and a new kind of pain. Her daughter's grief was a fresh cut, a reminder of how deeply Caleb's actions had rippled through their lives. But Lily was fierce, insisting they face the truth together. "You're not alone anymore, Mama," she said, and those words became Eleanor's lifeline. The grandchildren noticed the change in their grandmother. Emma, the eldest at 16, was particularly perceptive. "Grandma, you seem sad," she said one afternoon, sitting beside Eleanor on the porch. "Is it about Grandpa Thomas?" Eleanor hesitated. She'd always told the children stories of Thomas's kindness, his laughter, but never the darkness that followed his death. "It's a long story, sweetheart," she said, patting Emma's hand. "But maybe it's time you heard it." She didn't tell them everything, not yet. They were too young for the full weight of her pain. But she shared enough. That Thomas's death had broken her heart, and that his brother had hurt her deeply. Emma listened, her eyes wide, while Jacob and Sophie sat close, sensing the gravity of the moment. "You're so strong, Grandma," Emma said, and Eleanor smiled, though her heart ached. The family decided to honor Thomas's memory in a way that reclaimed the farm from the shadows of the past. Lily suggested a memorial garden, a place where they could plant flowers and sit in peace. Eleanor agreed, and the grandchildren threw themselves into the project, digging soil and choosing plants with a zeal that warmed her heart. They planted roses for Thomas's love, lavender for healing, and daisies for the innocence Eleanor had lost. As they worked, Eleanor began to write. She'd always kept a journal, but now she poured her story onto the pages, not just the pain, but the strength she'd found in surviving it. She wrote about Thomas's laughter, Lily's birth, the grandchildren's joy. She wrote about Caleb, too, not to forgive him, but to release him from the power he'd held over her for so long. The act of writing was like pulling thorns from her skin, painful but necessary. One evening, as the garden bloomed, Lily brought a letter from the mailbox. It was from Caleb's daughter, Sarah, a woman Eleanor had never met. Sarah had found her father's journal after his death, detailing his guilt and his attempt to make amends. She wrote to apologize, to offer whatever comfort she could. "I can't undo what he did," Sarah wrote, "but I want you to know I believe you and I'm sorry." Eleanor read the letter with Lily by her side, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't ready for that. But it was acknowledgement, a validation of her pain. She wrote back, a short note thanking Sarah for her words, and felt another piece of her heart settle. The garden became a gathering place, not just for the family, but for the community. Neighbors came to pay their respects, unaware of the deeper story, and Eleanor found herself sharing bits of her truth with those she trusted. The shame that had silenced her for decades began to fade, replaced by a quiet strength. She wasn't just the tough Grayson widow anymore. She was Eleanor, a woman who had faced unimaginable pain and built a life of love despite it. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, the family gathered in the garden, the air sweet with lavender. Eleanor stood before a small wooden bench they'd placed in Thomas's honor, her grandchildren at her side. She spoke of love, of loss, and of the courage to keep going. "Your grandfather would be proud of us," she said, her voice steady. "Not because we're perfect, but because we're here together." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't known in 50 years. The past would always be there, a scar on her heart, but it no longer defined her. She was more than her pain, more than her trauma. She was a mother, a grandmother, a survivor. And as she held her grandchildren close, she knew she'd given them something Caleb could never take. A legacy of love, rooted deep in the earth they'd tilled together.